Good evening, everyone. My name is Rochelle Ignacio, and on behalf of the Edmonton Culture Board of Directors and community partners, I'm very honored to welcome you to tonight's presentation, In Solidarity with Dr. Angela Davis. Tonight's presentation is possible through a community collaboration of organizations committed to anti-racism advocacy in Edmonton and the surrounding area. In addition to representing the Edmonton Culture Board, I'm also very honored to come to you as one of the founders of Black-Owned Market Edmonton, which is one of the community partners that's made tonight's presentation possible. In addition to Edmonton Community Foundation, DreamSpeakers, the City of Edmonton, the Pride Centre, Shift Lab, the Africa Centre, and the Caribbean Women's Network. December 6th marks the anniversary of the Montreal Massacre, which was an anti-feminist attack that took place on December 6, 1989. The gunmen specifically targeted women on campus. Tonight's presentation is part of the 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence, and we would like to acknowledge this tragedy and honor those who lost their lives, as well as those who were impacted by this horrific event. Although Edmonton culture has been around for a long time in the community, primarily putting together events to promote the diversity of Edmonton's culture, it is in the present that we have undertaken the mission towards an inclusive and sustainable organization, run by a team of dedicated and passionate members of the Edmonton community. Edmonton Culture exists to collaborate with other organizations, such as those who are tonight's presenting partners, who share our vision to advocate for anti-racist structures. If you would like to partner with Edmonton Culture in future events, we invite you to reach out at info@edmontonculture.com. We hope that you will feel inspired following tonight's presentation. Ensuring our events remains accessible is a key priority for the Edmonton Culture Board. Thank you to anyone who was able to make a donation to Edmonton Culture, which will help ensure we can have future presentations. Following this presentation, if you're interested in collaborating with us, we invite you to check out edmontonculture.com, and you can also find a donation portal there. Momentarily, we will hear from Christine Fredricks before local Edmontonians Shalini, Sinha, and Robyn Taylor interview Angela Davis. Following the interview, we'll be enjoying a spoken word performance from Elle Jones, at which point the audience members are invited to submit questions using the chat feature on the streaming platform they're viewing from. This is your time to have your question answered by Angela Davis, so please utilize this opportunity. Shalini and Robyn will be moderating the question and answer period. Former Youth Poet Laureate Tamirul Muhammad will be joining us for a spoken word performance, and we invite you to stick around for a panel discussion from community leaders from the city. They consist of Christine Fredricks, Dunia, Veronica Fuentes, and Ufuoma Odebala. I would like to acknowledge that we are located here on Treaty 6 territory, and I would like to welcome Christine Fredricks to lead us through a land acknowledgement. Christine is a panel member that we will hear from following tonight's conversation with Angela Davis, as well as the Executive Artistic Director of the DreamSpeakers Festival Society and producer of the annual DreamSpeakers Indigenous Film Festival, DIF. Welcome, Christine.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It gives me great pleasure in recognizing that the land that we are on right now, that we are presenting this work and these good words, is formally, as in officially known as Treaty Number 6 territory. That is a legal entity. It is what allows Canada, in fact, to be a legal entity here on this land. And when we do these political movements where we're acknowledging this land as a resource, we have different approaches to doing that. One is to recognize the legality of it. It's officially called Treaty Number 6. But also what I've learned from Indigenous peoples across this Turtle Island is to also recognize those who have holdings to this land beyond those who have signed on with the Crown. So those who signed Treaty Number 6 territory, such as the Cree, the Saulteaux, the Nakota Sioux, the Cree Iroquois, there's also the Métis and the Blackfoot who have been utilizing this land and have ties to this land for millennia before, maybe not the Métis, because we're a rather new nation in that regard, but also a wise practice that I've been given from these Indigenous peoples that I've met with, not only nationally, but globally as well, speak about recognizing those who have sacrificed to be here on this land, sometimes violently and sometimes involuntarily. It is also a lot of the work that we do as Indigenous artists, like to bring a different perspective on these political movements of acknowledging the land and the resources upon which we work and play, hoping that these political movements will become cultural movements and will become part of our daily consciousness and understanding of what it takes to be here. And in that regard, we also recognize that this land is a living entity. She is our mother. We are so grateful to our Mother Earth for all the gifts that she gives us that allow us to live, to work, to play, and to pray with her. So thank you very much for this time to acknowledge that. In my language of Cree, I say hai hai.
Thank you so much, Christine, for sharing your wisdom and teachings with us. Recognizing and understanding the complex history of Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit people here on Treaty 6 is the first step in working towards reconciliation. We need to understand that as we live, work, and play with our neighbors within the city of Edmonton. When we think of Angela Davis, there are many thoughts and feelings that come to mind, such as fierce yet compassionate, revolutionary yet graceful. And later today, we'll be hearing from a local group of Edmontonian women who are leading movements aimed at creating an anti-racist city. I feel that we can all learn from Angela as we move forward in leading these movements that deconstruct systems of oppression. Tonight, we would like to introduce Angela Davis and her work to you, our audience members, while framing this conversation using the perspective of local Edmontonians. We're honored to have two Edmontonians who are respectively working towards creating a more equitable and just city that we could live in. I would now like to introduce you to tonight's moderators. Shalini Sinha. She's the chair of the City of Edmonton's Anti-Racism Advisory Committee and chair of the board of the Pride Centre of Edmonton. She is a longtime anti-racism and equity consultant and educator, and has just founded her company, Inclusive, here in Edmonton, to resource leaders and entrepreneurs who care about climate and social justice. As an academic, she researched and taught on the intersection of gender and racism. She is also an experienced media broadcaster and columnist. She has been a climate and social justice activist since her teens and loves the land, all the weather in Alberta, and is a fan of stand-up comedy. Welcome, Shalini. Robyn Taylor is currently pursuing an economics degree at the University of Alberta. Hailing from the island of Jamaica, Robyn is passionate about empowering Edmonton's African, Black, and Caribbean youth through community building. She is the current program coordinator for Yeg the Come Up, a Black youth empowerment program under the Africa Centre that coordinates capacity building opportunities, leadership training, and community development initiatives for Edmonton's African, Caribbean, and Black youth communities. Outside of Yeg the Come Up, Robyn is the Alberta cohort coordinator for the 1834 Fellowship under Operation Black Vote Canada. There, along with the 1834 Fellowship team, Robyn mentors Black youth interested in policymaking and civic leadership opportunities. As a volunteer, Robyn is a core member on the Bomb Yeg team and a voting committee member on the City of Edmonton's Youth Council. She is interested in exploring visionary methods towards achieving long-term community development and is passionate about community models that are based on care. Robyn is so excited to learn from Dr. Angela Davis on meaningful ways to achieve sustainable change within our communities. And now, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Angela Davis to share her wisdom, her knowledge, and her grace with members of the Edmonton community. Through her activism and scholarship over the last decades, Angela Davis has deeply involved in her quest for social justice. Her work as an educator, both at the university level and the larger public sphere, has always emphasized the importance of building communities of struggle for economic, racial, and gender justice. Professor Davis's teaching career has taken her to San Francisco State University, Mills College, and UC Berkeley. She has also taught at UCLA, Vassar, and Claremont Colleges, and Stanford University. She spent the last 15 years at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where she is now a distinguished professor emerita of history of consciousness, an interdisciplinary PhD program, and of feminist studies. Angela Davis is the author of 9 books and has lectured throughout the United States, as well as Europe, Africa, Asia, and Australia, and South America. In recent years, a persistent theme of her work has been the range of social problems associated with incarceration and the generalized criminalization of those communities that are most affected by poverty and racial discrimination. She draws upon her own experiences in the early 70s as a person who spent 18 months in jail and on trial after being placed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. Davis has also conducted extensive research on numerous issues related to race, gender, and imprisonment. Her most recent book is Freedom is a Constant Struggle: Ferguson, Palestine, and the Foundations of a Movement. Davis is a founding member of Critical Resistance, a national organization dedicated to dismantling of the prison industrial complex. Internationally, she is affiliated with Sisters Inside, an abolitionist organization based in Queensland, Australia, that works in solidarity with women in prison. Like many other educators, Professor Davis is especially concerned with the general tendency to devote more resources and attention to the prison system than to educational institutions. Having helped to popularize the notion of the prison industrial complex, she now urges her audiences to think seriously about the future possibility of a world without prisons and to help forge a 21st century abolitionist movement. I'm now very pleased to turn it over to Shalini and Robyn, who will help guide us through tonight's presentation in solidarity with Angela Davis.
Thank you so much, Rochelle. Dr. Davis, it is such a pleasure to have you here with us, and I'm so excited for the conversation we'll be having. So, as Rochelle mentioned, in this space, we'd love to reflect, celebrate, and honor your work and contributions, as well as hear your insights and advice on issues that Edmonton is currently facing and will face. We recognize that the audience are probably composed of people that are of all levels of familiarity with you and your work. And we're hoping that our questions and our conversation can speak to all of them. So with that being said, Dr. Davis, you have made so many contributions as a community advocate, a scholar, an organizer, a revolutionary, a teacher, mentor, academic. And I'm just wondering, what aspects of your work do you feel proudest of? And also, what aspects of your work have brought you the most peace? And by peace, I mean maybe moments that have brought you the most healing or just the most clarity in how you've approached advocacy work.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this conversation. And so let me thank Rochelle Ignacio for the wonderful introduction and Christine Fredricks for the land acknowledgement. And I'd also like to thank you, Robyn Taylor, and Shalini Sinha. And let me say that it's really wonderful. It was wonderful to see Elle Jones again. I know she's a part of the program. And just let me say that whenever I visit Canada and experience encounters with Canadian activists, I always feel really energized that, whether it's a live visit or a virtual visit. So thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this conversation in Edmonton. So yeah, you've asked me about what I most feel proud about. And, I suppose I can say generally that it's the collective victories that make me recognize how important my own contributions have been. I can't separate my individual contributions from the work of people who have been involved around a range of issues. And let me say that now, given the fact that there is a public conversation about abolition, prison abolition, police abolition, new ways of addressing the social problems that are responsible for the fact that so many people are behind bars, new forms of public safety. I'm so excited about that. And I should probably tell you that as a person who's been advocating abolition for many decades, along with my comrades who have attempted to point out that we need radical solutions. I never expected to actually personally experience a moment like this. And I often point out when I'm engaging in conversation that we are unaware of how historical conjunctures will take shape in the future. We never really know what is going to happen. We could never have predicted the consequences of a pandemic combined with a growing awareness of the structural character of racism, combined with the response to police murders, police lynchings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others. We could never have imagined that specific confluence of events. However, the fact that people have continued to challenge racist police violence and have been engaging in conversations about prison abolition and new ways of envisioning safety and security of our communities meant that it was possible to take advantage of this moment. And so I'm not only proud about it, but I'm really happy that I get to witness this moment, particularly because there's so many people who contributed to the creation of this moment who are no longer with us. So in many ways, I feel that those of us who are still alive are witnessing this moment for our fallen comrades. And you ask about peace. I don't know whether I consider peace an individual phenomenon. Of course, I love peaceful moments, listening to music or whatever. But I've almost never felt at peace with what we have done, because I'm always convinced that we could have done more, and that we make a great mistake if we think that once we achieve a particular victory, we can simply sit back and bask in that victory. Because each victory, it seems to me, should be an occasion for us to rethink and remake our arenas of struggle. And so I love peace, but I don't like the idea of being at peace with what we have done.
Right. Thank you so much for that. I really enjoyed that duality, I guess, that you're expressing, where we find encouragement in the fact that we are making progress as a collective, but it also reminds us of how much work we have to continue doing as a movement. Thank you so much for that.
Absolutely.
Yes, I love that too. And really heard those themes that you're talking about, really appreciated them. How you're saying that your proudest moment is actually the way people come together and as a group make change. And we're so proud that this event is called In Solidarity. And we're going to come more to how we create that solidarity and your wisdom in around solidarity. And I also really appreciate what you said about this incredible moment that we're standing at this moment. I think I and others can get a glimpse of this at the city and the opportunities we have. And really looking forward to asking you some questions and getting some guidance. But before we go into some of those more details, I wanted to ask you this question, which is bigger and broader again, and it is a connection with the arts and activism. So what I've been thinking about is how yourself and many others, myself, those of us here, we have identities that cross so many layers of class, race, gender, sexuality, so many different layers. And for others, I found that it's hard for them sometimes to think through holding all those layers at the same time. When I think of that, I think about the role the arts can play in helping humans figure out these layers and open their minds. And as a young teen activist, one of my favorite quotes, which is by a woman, Emma Goldman, was, "If I can't dance, I don't want to be in your revolution," which has guided me. What I was wondering was your experience of the arts and activism, this relationship, and maybe even a moment when your own mind was opened just a little bit further by some expression of art that you saw.
Well, thank you for that question. By the way, I really love that Emma Goldman quote as well. It reminds me of something that my mentor, Professor Herbert Marcuse, used to say. He used to say that when it comes down to the simplest terms, what we want our work to do, whether we're talking about scholarly work or whether we're talking about activist work, what we want our work to do is increase the possibilities of happiness in the world. And you know, art not only creates joy, dancing and enjoying music and visual art, but I think it helps us to reflect on a deeper level. You express the complexities of our lives and the way in which we sometimes find it difficult to hold, you know, all of these aspects of our social lives, our identities, but also the way we experience the world, to hold all of these different elements in tension. Well, you know, art does this, and it does it in a way that makes it possible for us to experience those complexities without having to feel that we aren't able to put it all together, because artists put it together for us in a way that makes us, I think, reflect more deeply about our lives. And therefore, I would argue that art and the what Marcuse used to call the aesthetic dimension helps us to know more deeply. Art has an epistemological function. It helps us to generate different kinds of knowledges. And during this period when so many artists have been inspired, visual artists, musical artists, poets, literary artists, have been inspired to play a role in these efforts to transform our worlds. I think it's so important to recognize that this is what the struggle is all about. And art has to be in the forefront of political change. Art, as I've said on some occasions, art can help us to feel what we haven't yet figured out how to express in our usual languages. It can help us grasp where we want to go before we can actually put it in words. And so I'm so excited to see the ways in which artists have engaged with this moment. And I want us to think about, you know, artists as beacons, as providing, as lighting the way, I guess, as serving as a beacon for us as we move toward what otherwise might sometimes feel like an unknown future.
Yeah, that has given me so much warmth actually inside as I think about that and hear about that, the way that art can help us feel before we understand, and how powerful that is, how leading it is. And it reminds me of how scholars have identified and shown us that those societies where justice was existing, that art thrived because humans could connect and be humans through the struggle. So I love that. I think Robyn's going to take us into more of the meat of how we get through this.
Yes, and again, I just want to say that I also appreciate that perspective about how art provides that vehicle for understanding, especially when we are approaching and faced with these complex layers of struggle. And I actually want to talk about Edmonton now, where we are in a new unprecedented time. We just had an election and we have now elected our first South Asian mayor, our first mayor that's also not white. We have a new city council that's composed of 8 women, 2 of whom are of Asian heritage, which is again unprecedented. And we also have a re-elected Indigenous councillor. And generally, there's this sense of excitement and awareness because there's this potential for great change. But I was actually reminded of a line in your book, Freedom as a Constant Struggle, where you say, I don't think we can rely on governments, regardless of who is in power, to do the work that only mass movements can do. And I know that this was a very specific context in regards to the Ferguson protests and the election of Barack Obama. But I was wondering if you could speak more about this quote and maybe the parallels that you see with the Edmontonian context here, and particularly why you choose to focus or why you emphasize the power of mass movements.
Well, first of all, congratulations. And I should, I guess what I want to say at the outset is that precisely because people of color have been excluded from such official leadership positions for so long, we like to celebrate the first, as you said, the first South Asian mayor. But I think that can sometimes be a bit misleading. And as important as it might be to engage in those celebrations, we also need to point to the politics of the person who was elected. Because I think that we're sometimes misled by those centuries of exclusion to assume that anyone who represents communities of color and is elected into office will move in a progressive direction. But we also know that that's not the case. So I guess what I would say is that we have elected our first progressive South Asian mayor. Because people have asked me whether I'm excited about the election of the first Black South Asian woman vice president. And I'm a bit conflicted about that. Because of the fact that there are aspects of her history that do not excite me very much. But at the same time, and this goes back to the quotes that you read that I guess I said in Freedom is a Constant Struggle, that change is rarely made by individuals. It's rarely made by the figures whose names we know, the individuals. Change is made by people coming together and struggling and displaying the power of masses of people. And so I think I would say that this always holds true, whether we're talking about a president like Barack Obama, or whether we're talking about a local elected official. The person who makes of that election an exciting phenomenon is the person who is elected who also understands that she or he or they are there by virtue of the work that has been done by masses of people. And that it is their responsibility to maintain a sense of connection with those people who have struggled to change history. I don't think great individuals ever transform history. It's always about people coming together and engaging in the kind of a struggle that can overturn old notions of racism and class exploitation and I understand that this event today pays tribute to the terrible event in Toronto, in which large numbers of women were killed. Misogyny and people who are willing to continue to engage and struggle against gender violence. Not only speak out one time, but speak out a million times, and to do it not simply as individuals, but together with others.
What you're saying there about how it's actually mass movements that get people to where they are is a way that I'm connecting now with this thinking, because I think in my mind, I mean, the things that you're saying resonate so much. And yet I think sometimes for myself, I'll joke with my kids, I bring them down to vote since they were in buggies and, have demonstrated by modeling civic duty. And yet we come home and usually the person I voted for doesn't get elected. And how a mass movement can actually come together and push that change and make some kind of connection with those elected leaders and what is happening. Because I think I can sometimes feel disenfranchised from them. I know right now I'm in that position of being an in-between person through community and our municipal government, but I can feel disenfranchised. So that's really powerful to me. Let's talk a little bit about some of the events that have happened in Canada over, not even this year, over the last few months, where in our communities we heard about Indigenous people finding the evidence of unmarked graves at residential school sites here on the land. And so much of the media and the mainstream conversation was about the discovery of these graves. And yet Indigenous people were talking about this for a very long time. And it wasn't until they managed to collect the evidence that started to be heard. But I think it also started to be heard because of these same pandemic dynamics that have been happening. Alberta is a place that had the most residential schools of all the provinces in Canada. We had a very large one here in Edmonton. This piece here talking about how policies can change but not change. We had the residential school system shift into the child welfare system, which functioned the same way, to separate Indigenous children from their people, from their families, to enact a genocide. And I think often in Canada and in Edmonton, which houses the second largest urban Indigenous population in Canada, non-Indigenous people can be disconnected. And even those of us who fight for anti-racism can be disconnected in that solidarity with Indigenous people and how paramount that is. And I'm wondering about your thoughts about building that solidarity and standing with Indigenous people.
Well, first of all, I think we all know that genocidal assaults against Indigenous people were foundational to the history of the Americas. Not only North America, where Canada and the US are located, but all over South America, Central America. And when we speak about racial capitalism, which is a term that is used with increasing frequency, and I'm happy about that, because it's not possible to separate racism from capitalism. But sometimes we start with slavery and its connection with capitalism, and we forget that the very foundation of the possibilities of capitalism was created by the assault on indigenous people all over the Americas. And therefore, if we don't acknowledge and struggle against the continued consequences of this genocide, then whatever change we envision will be lacking a pivotal element. And of course, one of the ways in which indigenous people have been so deeply assaulted is through the assumption of invisibility. The whole notion that this was a land without a people, terra nullius, right? From the outset, the lack of a way of acknowledging the presence of the first peoples of this land was central to the framework that led us to where we are now, where the finding when we talk about the discovery of unmarked graves at residential school sites in Canada, in the US, in Australia, all over, wherever indigenous people were to be found, and that is throughout the Americas. This should not be something that is astounding to people. We should have known that this is precisely how it was possible to build an economy and a society on somebody else's land. And so therefore, I do think the land acknowledgements are important, but sometimes we get stuck. Just as we get stuck with the diversity and inclusion, whatever they're called. We think that this is the way out, and all you have to do is create what is it called? Diversity, DEI?
Your equity, diversity, inclusion.
Yes. And that once we've done that, we've done all of the work. And I think we're experiencing something similar with land acknowledgements. And I think land acknowledgements are so important, but they're just a starting point. They're not the end point. So with respect to the connections between the histories of indigenous people and people of African descent, I think it's so important to acknowledge that we would not have Black history in the way that it has unfolded as a history of a struggle for liberation without the assistance of indigenous people. From the very outset, slave uprisings were rendered possible precisely because of the fact that indigenous people assisted enslaved people of African descent. So there's so many ways in which we can talk about this. I'm so happy to see within the academic arena that the new fields are emerging, not only Native American or Indigenous studies and Black studies, but fields that examine the continuous interaction among Indigenous and Black people. But let me just say this is a subject that we could talk about for a very long time. I am actually happy that finally in the US, finally some of the sports teams have been made to recognize how racist they have been and continuing to perpetrate a kind of epistemic violence on Indigenous people through the titles of their various teams. So, yeah, there are so many ways in which we can acknowledge this. But I think perhaps what's most important of all, and I don't like to create hierarchies like that, but climate change and environmental justice. And this is something that Indigenous people have always insisted upon. So now more than ever before, it is necessary to follow the leadership of Indigenous people if we expect to save this planet. Otherwise we will be moving toward oblivion.
Yes. Thank you, Angela. And just on that piece, to confirm or add that the city's Anti-Racism Advisory Committee, just at our recent meeting, ratified 2 priorities that we are carrying for at least this term, if not further. So one is around safety, around policing, and we're rising to and handling those issues. But the second one is to raise awareness for creating understanding of the connection between racism and the climate emergency, and to catalyze anti-racist action to end the climate emergency, and to really amplify what you're saying there, which is that this is about backing Indigenous leadership.
Yeah. I wanted to say I really appreciate the emphasis that you place on solidarity, on the necessity of different ways of knowing, on uplifting Indigenous leadership and acknowledge Indigenous ways of knowing and of doing more. It reminds me of, where we can be at peace, but we're really not at peace. So we need to keep moving forward. And, I would never want to miss the opportunity to talk about abolition and maybe how all of this ties in to that topic. Rochelle mentioned in your introduction that your focus is on forging a 21st century abolitionist movement. And I was just wondering if you could speak more about what that means and maybe what that looks like, especially when it comes to youth. How can youth be involved more in this 21st century abolitionist movement?
Well, I have to admit that when we began talking about a 21st century abolitionist movement, we were still in the 20th century. And it was a hope. It was when we organized critical resistance, one of the major tasks we took on was to make it possible for people to think more capaciously about the issues of incarceration and the police, and link these issues to the overall crisis of capitalism, and to recognize that in order to address what came to be called mass incarceration, in order to address racist police violence, we would have to change our worlds, create a new society, challenge capitalism, and so when we said 21st century abolitionist movement, we were thinking about the fact that there was a 19th century abolitionist movement that was directed towards the abolition of slavery. There was a 20th century abolitionist movement that was really, which some people call the civil rights movement, that targeted the legacies of slavery and what was called second-class citizenship. And it's interesting that Howard Zinn wrote a book about SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the role that they played in what is often known as the civil rights movement, but what people call the freedom movement. And the title of that book was The New Abolitionists. And so many of us began to imagine a 21st century abolitionist movement that would not only address mass incarceration and the role that global capitalism has played in guaranteeing the creation of more and more prisons and the depositing of more and more people who are rendered surplus populations by the development of racial capitalism into these prisons. So that we began to imagine the possibility of radical change, of new worlds. And that was how we saw the 21st century unfolding. But, this was a vision. This was the way we imagined the future. And as I said before, as much as we posit these goals, these lofty goals, we're sometimes shocked when we actually achieve them. So I think that I never fail to be excited whenever I hear young people, talking about abolition and the role of the imagination and challenging capitalism, challenging racial capitalism. So I think that we are now witnessing this 21st century abolitionism, which is far more interesting and far more complicated than I could have imagined myself when we were talking about it at the end of the 20th century. And let me just say that, and this is not really a plug, but I just collaborated on a new book that is called Abolition, Feminism Now. And I'm one of four co-authors, Beth Ritchie, Erica Miners, and Gina Dent are the other three authors. And in that book, what we do is we look at how important it has been to link abolition and feminism. That feminism is at its most powerful when it is abolitionist. And abolition is at its most powerful when it is also feminist.
Please do plug the book, Angela, because some of us really can't get enough of your writings. Tell us again, it's Abolition and Feminism?
It's called Abolition, period, Feminism, period, Now, period. And
beautiful.
I love that. This reminds me of your interview with Ava DuVernay, where she says, I love interviews with you because there's just a whole book list attached and a list of citations attached after every interview. And I 100% understand how she feels. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Sorry, Shalini, go ahead.
That's okay. I was just going to add another plug because I think your autobiography is being reprinted and that it can be pre-ordered now. And I believe in our audience, there will be a lot of people. There'll be people like myself and Robyn whose breath literally stopped when we first heard from Edmonton Culture that they were going to bring Angela Davis. Mm-hmm. And there are people who are being introduced to your work for the very first time. And to know that they can pre-order your autobiography now, it's coming out in January, is just a wonderful introduction to you and your work.
Yeah, hold on just 1 second.
Right now, here live, folks.
I just got it in the mail just yesterday.
Oh, congratulations. That is wonderful.
Yeah, and it's basically the same autobiography that I wrote in 1972. Toni Morrison was my editor then. Wow. But I do have a short preface to the new edition in which I reflect on the meaning of the work, in which I recount some of my own reactions in rereading it, and there are moments when I can't believe I was so stupid and so had such little insight. I mean, that was, of course, reading the book 50 years later. I often say, how could I have believed that? How could I have said that? But at the same time, that's exciting for me because I can actually see how change happens and how changes happen in my own ideas that are, of course, a reflection of the collective ideas of people who are struggling for a better world.
Hearing you say that reminds me of two questions that I actually want to ask you. But the first question I want to ask is just, I know that there are a lot of youth advocates here, and especially youth that are new in their advocacy journey. And with the emphasis that you put on solidarity and working together as a community, and also the reflection that you place on the different stages in your advocacy journey, I really want to ask you, what was the role of mentorship in your life? I know you mentioned your mentor earlier, but just speaking more on that, what was the role of mentorship in your life? And also, how can we be better mentors towards each other?
Well, I like the idea of mentoring each other that you just raised. And I think that mentorship has been absolutely central in my life, even when I didn't realize I was being mentored. I often talk about the fact that that my mother was an activist, and I really followed her along that path, although I did not realize it at the time. And it's only now that I'm recognizing how important her mentorship was in helping me to think collectively and helping me to engage in the imagination, engage in feats of imagining the future at a time when the present seems to be so disheartening. And so, yeah, I think we mentor. I think we mentor as we are mentored. And I don't think mentorship has to move along age lines. It's not that the mentor is always the older person. It's not that the mentorship is always about the wisdom that comes with age. Mentorship is also about learning how to think in new ways. And young people, of course, are far more capable of doing that than those of us who are older. I am always so impressed when I listen to young activists and scholars using vocabularies that we could hardly discover, that we sort of had to grope our way towards in order to try to express something that we were just beginning to understand. And now I see young people using that as a kind of launching point and moving towards ideas that would have never been imaginable within older frameworks. So I think that it is very important for older people to discover ways of being mentored by the youth, and that kind of collaborative mentorship is what I think will help us move forward.
That is so beautiful, and what a wonderful place to leave us there. Older people being reminded to look to young people for mentorship. Angela, genuinely, Robyn and I would love to keep talking to you, asking you more questions. We have some beautiful questions here, but we need to get to release you back to the community for questions and answers. What I want to do right now is invite Rochelle Ignacio back to the stage. She's going to be introducing one of our panelists who has the pleasure of introducing her friend and your friend, Angela, who will be sharing with us a beautiful artistic spoken word performance. So welcome back, Rochelle.
Thank you. Before moving forward, I do want to apologize on behalf of the board for anyone who had troubles logging in. We've added the links to our website, as well as an email was sent out to all Eventbrite attendees. So please, if you're able to, share on your social media networks so that everyone can tune in, and invite people to join us for the Q&A portion that will be following. I'd also like to thank everyone for engaging with one another in the chat feature, and I encourage our audience members to join in respectfully with one another in this dialogue. Thank you so much to Angela Davis, Shalini, and Robyn for joining together in solidarity for tonight's captivating conversation. The audience really is enjoying the selection of questions being used to guide the discussion. Tonight's conversation has demonstrated there are many actions required to achieve liberation, which as an activist or ally can be quite scary and require us to put in a tremendous amount of work. We as individuals may not see the change that we're fighting for in our generation, but revolutionaries such as Angela Davis, as well as leaders in our own communities, are paving a path forward. Advocacy and activism is not an easy path, and while it may not reap the same reward as maybe being a musician or an athlete, the result is worth so much more. It's worth so much more than the burden that we must carry. And we have to remember that we don't have to carry that alone. So tonight, let us carry forward in solidarity with one another in our quest to create a more just society. Thank you for continuing to be our inspiration, Angela. Just as a reminder, we'll have an audience-generated question and answer period following the spoken word performance. So please prepare your questions and submit them using the chat feature from the platform you're streaming from. And with that, I would like to invite Dunia, who is a panelist that we'll hear from later tonight, as well as the president of the African Canadian Civic Engagement Council, to the stage. Dunia is going to be introducing Elle Jones for her spoken word performance.
Thank you so much, Rochelle, for the kind introduction. Hello, everyone. My name is Dunia, and tonight I'm honored to introduce someone that is close to my heart and my sister, Elle Jones. Elle is a poet, journalist, professor, and activist living in Halifax, Nova Scotia. We invited Elle here with us this evening as someone that's close to Dr. Angela Davis, but at the same time, someone who's worked extensively with the community of Edmonton, guiding, mentoring, and providing genuine, authentic solidarity. I reached out to Elle in 2019 in a case regarding a child refugee deportation, and Elle Jones supported us and helped us, strategized with us, mobilized with us, including our brother Desmond Cole and many more. I am happy to share that because of their support and consistent commitment to our community, being Black in the prairies, which sometimes could be lonely and isolating, they really supported us, and that led to the cancellation and saving the life of a child refugee that was about to be deported and displaced. I'm also happy to share that the United Nations intervened and stopped that deportation through the strategy that people like Elle supported us with. My sister is an incredible human being who continues to coach, mentor, and support all communities. She's a national advocate, an activist, and organizer. I would like to welcome my sister who believes that poetry can empower the powerless and give voice to the voiceless, Elle Jones.
Thank you so much, Dunia. It's such an honor. You're always building solidarity, particularly solidarity among Black women, and it's really beautiful to see. I'm going to do this poem. I'm just going to give you a couple of references. Donald Marshall is a wrongful conviction in Nova Scotia, a very famous wrongful conviction of a Mi'kmaq man. And Glenn Assoon is also a wrongful conviction. I think you just need to know those two things. I know a man who stabbed a man inside and got sent off to the shoe. But he says when somebody comes after you, then what else do you do? I don't believe that he's a monster. But that's what the systems say. And now he's doing double life and might not see the light of day. And when you're 15 and your family teaches you to sell crack, well, is there any coming back? So you grow to manhood in the max. And we define entire lives by a person's worst acts, so we just list their various crimes and believe we have the facts. So here's another story of another lost defendant. He's 20 years old and he's 8 years into his sentence, brought over to the prison from juvenile detention. Sometimes children in this country just don't deserve a mention until they commit a crime, and then suddenly we pay attention. There are people in society we label as disposable. When you're already doing time, shouldn't be the first time you're diagnosable, and so we put them in a prison where at least they are controllable. And I suppose it isn't notable. And no one gets emotional. Unless we find out that they're innocent, then maybe humanity's negotiable. But for the rest, you did the crime. So your humanity is ignored. And men are in so long they don't know how to use a door. And men are in so long they've never heard of Internet Explorer. That's what happens when you're Black, when you're indigenous or poor, when you're considered to be criminal before you're even born. I get an incoherent call at 3 o'clock in the morning. The same guy who called me crying to report he was assaulted, he says he's locked up in his room, surrounded by guns and knives. If they come to take him back, it's either his or their lives. He said ever since he left the prison, he's been numbing with a high, but people say to close his mouth because it doesn't happen to real guys. I suppose it's ironic. He's from the same reserve as Donald Marshall. So it seems to me that justice there was only ever partial. When we look back at that case and say those 11 years were awful, but for everybody else, the same suffering is lawful. I've heard so many tragic stories, I could almost tick off a box, but still, we call it justice once the prison doors are locked. We believe that punishment comes to the people who deserve it, but punishment mostly comes to the people who can't swerve it, can't avoid it, can't employ it, can't voice it, can't afford it, and then once you go to prison, whatever happens, can't report it. So we talk about wrongful, but what are the rightful convictions? Sure, there's Paul Bernardo, Clifford Olson, Robert Pickton, but what about the man on his 50th charge of shoplifting when it's obvious to everyone the problem is addiction? And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission can only be a fiction as long as Indigenous people are still filling up the prison. I have a hard time seeing justice as a reserve without a well, but then we bring its children a smudge kit in their cell. Don't we wonder what will happen when there's foster kids living in hotels or Black children in the principal's office 5 minutes past the bell because they never learned to read and they fell between the gaps? We start with zero tolerance by the time they're done taking naps. Is it justice when some people start the race ahead by laps in a country where we can't even guarantee clean water from the taps and there's Indigenous land under every prison on the map? And as you move up from minimum to medium to max, it's a funny thing in Canada how the skin just gets more black. And that lack of access to parole that is kind of like a tax, a couple of years of extra sentence that they tack onto our backs. And there's those weapons laws they pass that they claim are for the gangs, while there's white supremacists in prisons with KKK upon their hands, and there's guards who give them daps. And the police can gun down teenagers and never hit the stand. I won't even get into asking why we never charge the banks, but should anyone be sent to where they have to carry shanks? I watched police roll into Ferguson with snipers riding tanks. I don't believe you have to not have done it for justice to be miscarried. When I've known men so long in prison that their babies now are married. Hell, I've known men so long in prison they first meet their son out on the range, and I don't know that it is justice we decide you can never change. And I don't know that it is justice when there's men inside a cage, and I don't know that it is justice that the scales will never budge, and men in prison with so much legal knowledge they could be a judge. And maybe they could have gone in that direction if they only got a nudge. And it's true. I have known men who did a killing for a grudge. But does 3 seconds of your life make you only human sludge? And let's not talk about the corporations that profit off it all, like the predatory phone companies gouging prisoners for a call, woman going broke when her man's conviction's not her fault. I could talk about the scanners and how many hits are false, families turned away after driving up for hours because I don't know that it is justice when it's so easy to abuse powers. I could talk to you for days. It would all be the same ruin, and I know men who did their time down in prison with us soon, but they'll never be set free to share their voices in these rooms. And I know lawyers, guards, and judges who do their best to change the two. But in a society that's broken, that's like reaching for the moon. And I confess, I once believed that every person could be saved. And it took a couple of years, and it's true that I got played and I had to face it. There's some people who seem to want to dig a grave. But I still don't believe that they deserve solitary just because they misbehaved. And I still believe we can do better, and we have to find a way. And I'd still rather know I tried, even if it meant I failed, because it never will be justice, while our solution time in Kent, down to people in Renous, from the people in the county up to people in the shoe. If that was your life story, what do you think you'd do? Thank you, everybody. And I want us to remember on this day that prison is violence, prison is gendered violence, and we must, if we want to fight against violence, we have to fight against expansion of prisons in our communities. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Elle. That was very powerful and a lot to take away. I would like to now bring back Shalini and Robyn.
Thank you so much, Elle. I am so moved by that, and reminded of our earlier conversation around art and how art helps us feel and see things that we don't quite understand yet. We're going to move into the section of question and answers for Angela Davis from the audience. I would like to welcome back Angela Davis now. Thank you so much. Wonderful to see you. We have quite a number of questions here from our audience, which we're delighted with. I'm going to start with a question from Alana Joy, and I'm going to try and paraphrase it as I go. Alana is asking about how, as we participate in activism with goals of radical social change and equity, what advice would you give for those whose goal is to dismantle deep patriarchal ideology within community of friends, family, and co-workers? And in particular, Alana is thinking about neighbors and people around us who are struggling with this ideology. Just to start there, we might as well start there.
Well, I'm still feeling within myself the responses to the amazing spoken word performance by Elle Jones. So let me first of all thank her, and I hope people reflect on her words and think deeply about the importance of eventually abolishing prisons and the prison industrial complex.
Shall I come back? Because you're so right. I was also so moved. I was moved also by my job to move the agenda forward, so jumped into questions. But honestly, we all needed a moment and a breath after being impacted so deeply by such powerful words and how they were spoken and what it means to understand how deeply wrong the prison system is and who's suffering. So thank you for taking that moment for us to pause. Let me ask the question again, coming back. So Alana's question is really, it's in two parts. And what they're really asking about here is, as we participate in activism with goals of radical social change and equity, what advice would you have for us, for us whose goal is to dismantle deeply patriarchal ideology within our community of friends, family, and co-workers? And they're specifically asking how they engage neighbors who benefit from patriarchal and racist systems.
Well, I was about to say that, just as people who might not yet be willing to assume radical positions around imprisonment and the prison industrial complex, upon hearing something like Elle presented us, can, possibly be changed. And And so since we've been talking about the role of art, I want to first point out that it might be helpful to introduce some visual art or some spoken word, poetry. This process of dismantling heteropatriarchy is going to be a very long process. And I think what's perhaps most important for us to recognize now is that we don't really accomplish a great deal if we assume that an individual is responsible for patriarchal ideology. If we engage in conversations with someone as if it were their choice to embrace this ideology.
Yeah.
I also want to say that just as many people have recognized that structural racism is at the very foundation of all of the other manifestations of racism, that we make a mistake if we assume that individuals are responsible for racism, and that we can only effectively challenge racism if we engage with individuals in such a way as to make them feel as if there's something really wrong with them if they're racist. So I want to frame the answer this way by pointing out that, first of all, we have to recognize the structural character of misogyny and heteropatriarchy, that it is in all of our institutions, it is in our language, and that we begin the process of transformation by encouraging people to be critical, to recognize, to question. And sometimes that takes a long time. You're not going to change a person overnight who has been deeply affected by heteropatriarchal ideology. But the point is to begin the conversation. And the point is to engage in the conversation in such a way as to allow people to recognize that this is a systemic, this is a structural issue, and that we are only now beginning a process that should have been begun a long time ago.
Yes, absolutely. And such a powerful point for us all to take home, to do remember that it is no one's desire or intention to have taken this on. We have all been in the system where we've all been saturated in it. And so, as you say, Angela, how do we assist people to think critically from where they are?
Well, I always like to encourage people to ask questions about everything. Nothing should be immune to critical engagement. And as we have learned more recently, even the very language that we use to pose the questions has to also be questioned. The fact that in recent years we have begun to reflect on the ways in which pronouns themselves are a tool of subjugation and oppression. And I think it's important to recognize, and I make this point often, that the trans movement has been so important to us in the sense that we have learned how to question that which we consider to be most normal, and so I think, to me, that's the definition of ideology. Wanima Lubiana once pointed out, she once pointed out that whatever is considered most normal is a product of ideology. And so to learn how to engage in that kind of deep questioning of what seems to be so self-evident is the process of critical thinking and critical engagement.
I was just watching your interview yesterday, actually, where you brought up that quote. So thank you so much for sharing that. I do want to ask the next question by Tiffany Walsh. So what they say is that, Dr. Davis, your activism and role modeling have been so profound and impactful for me in my burgeoning career in gender-based violence prevention, anti-racism, and anti-colonialism. But this work is exhausting, especially as a fellow woman of color and a survivor. They mentioned this quote that you have where you say, you have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time. Tiffany says that they try to reflect on this to keep themselves going. But their question for you is, how do you protect yourself and keep yourself going, especially in this day and age of constant trauma, online lynching, violence, and pain?
Well, again, I think that it's a collective process. I protect myself by always recognizing that I'm not simply an individual, that I'm a part of a community, and even we've been talking about self-care now for a number of years. But oftentimes the very notion of self-care posits an individual who does collective work, but then has to take care of herself and therefore goes off to do the individual work of meditating or practicing yoga or whatever. And I think that maintains that sense, that capitalist notion of the primacy of the individual. And I always try to catch myself because, of course, we live in a capitalist society, and we've all been deeply affected by the ways in which individualism circulates, particularly with respect to neoliberal ideologies, and so I try to reconnect with communities, whether it is through music, because music is a collective process, or whether it is through actually engaging people in discussions about how we retain our health. Many years ago, I was involved in an organization called the National Black Women's Health Project, which today is called the Black Women's Health Imperative. And I learned as a result of being involved in that organization that we cannot separate our physical and mental and spiritual health, that we have to think organically about the relationship. And I would say that I would add political to that. So we have physical health, mental health, spiritual health, and political, the political health of our communities. So I don't have any formulas, but I constantly return to that. I try never to be ensconced in the notion that I am an isolated individual who has to discover all of the answers within herself. I always think about my community when it comes to my spiritual health, when it comes to my mental health, when it comes to my physical health, and when it comes to my political health.
Right. There's just such incredible power in communities to restore and to heal. And thank you so much for reminding us that we're not alone. And especially in this journey, it does us no favors to rely only on the individual when we have a collective and a community that we're fighting with and for.
Beautiful. I'd like to now invite Elle Jones, who we all know we would like to hear more from, and Elle does have a question to ask. So, Elle, please ask your question.
Good evening, Dr. Davis. You've spoken about solidarity between the Black radical movement and Palestine. In this country, we've seen increasing attacks intensifying specifically upon Black activists who are engaging in Palestinian solidarity work, from author Desmond Cole saying "Free Palestine" at the Toronto District School Board and getting condemned, to the McGill Black students, to Black medical students. So could you speak a little bit about the importance of countering anti-Palestinian racism and the role of Palestine in 21st century abolition?
Well, thank you so much for raising that question, Elle. Because I think internationalism is really pivotal to our political health. That we cannot really imagine a more radical future if we think of our community, however we imagine that community, our country, or even the region of North America in isolation from the world. And precisely because Israel is the only settler colonial state that is continuing to try to expand its power. Of course, we both live in countries that are founded on settler colonialism, but Israel is not only settler colonialism, but it continues to evict Palestinians from their homes. It continues to try to take their land. And so the very sign of internationalism during this period requires solidarity with people who are struggling in Palestine. And I think that Black people have to learn how to stand up and defend Palestine and defend the capacity to express public solidarity with Palestine. And, you know, sometimes we kind of shrink in fear when these situations emerge. But I think it's important to embrace sometimes these attacks. I was, last year, was it last year or year before last, COVID time is very different. This temporality of the pandemic has affected our way of thinking about recent history. But I was offered a Human Rights Award by the Civil Rights Institute in Birmingham. And then they rescinded it. They took it back because of my activism around Palestine. And at first I could hardly grasp the fact that they were doing this. And then it made me upset and sad and angry. But then, as a consequence of all of the conversations that took place, not only in Birmingham, but all over the country and all over the world, but specifically in Birmingham, conversations in the Black community, conversations in Jewish communities in Birmingham, where people came out and openly criticized the Civil Rights Institute for withdrawing the award, as if some people deserve human rights and other people don't. So I think this is such an important moment to give expression to internationalist solidarity. And when we express solidarity with the people of Palestine who are struggling against this occupation that has existed since 1948, and that has been expanded over and over again, we are expressing solidarity with people who are struggling for freedom all over the world.
Thank you so much.
So we do have time for one last question, and this one is from Femi Akinsanya. He says, "Good evening, Dr. Davis," or they say, "Good evening, Dr. Davis. When it comes to addressing interracial, sexual, and gender-based violence in racialized communities, how can we adequately provide education, resources, support, and justice to those who have experienced the violence without further perpetuating racist and colonial mindsets that criminalize and demonize cis-hetero men of color? Is there a healthy middle ground when addressing the intersection of intraracial and interracial violence?"
Well, I'm not sure whether there's a middle ground, but I do think we have to recognize that this is a process. And again, I point to the ways in which capitalism affects the way we imagine solutions. And that is to say, solutions are seen as instantaneous or immediate, or they always involve being able to point to what has changed right now, and some of these issues are so enormous that it is going to take a long time, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't act with urgency or that we shouldn't demand immediate changes, but it means that we have to recognize that if we don't develop a vision of how to engage in the process of minimizing and then hopefully eventually abolishing gender violence, then we get nowhere. I think that the whole idea that an individual, that simply identifying an individual perpetrator and bringing that individual perpetrator to justice, as the term goes, I don't think it's really about justice at all. It's about punishing. Simply engaging in punishment is going to accomplish something in terms of the process of eradicating gender violence from our society. That does not work at all. So I think that there may still be online documents from the organization Generation 5, which pointed out that if we are actually going to get rid of abuse, sexual abuse, violent abuse, especially in families, and especially in our communities, that we have to plot a trajectory that is going to probably take at least 5 generations. And that is why the organization was called Generation 5. And the assumption was that the answers would perhaps emerge from engagements among people who've been abused and people who have done the abusing. So that rather than thinking about the perpetrator as someone who has to simply be punished, think of the perpetrator as someone who can also participate in the process of rooting out these terrible violences from our worlds. And in that respect, I think that indigenous temporalities, and I've said this many times, can be so helpful to us in thinking about how to engage in the kind of activism that will bring about lasting change. That if we think about what the impact will be generations from now, 3 generations, 5 generations, 7 generations from now, then we might actually begin to accomplish a great deal more in the present.
Absolutely beautiful, Angela. We have so many more questions from our audience. But we have come to our time, and I'd like to invite Rochelle back to introduce our next piece and to thank you. But on behalf,
may I just say one thing? I'm really interested in looking at the questions, if there's any possibility of downloading them and sending them to me so that I can reflect on how people responded. I would really appreciate that.
I'm absolutely certain that Edmonton Culture can accommodate that. And I know Rochelle's going to thank you, but on behalf of myself and Robyn, it has been an absolute pleasure, a personal pleasure, to be in conversation with you, Angela, this evening.
Thank you. I want to thank all of our audience members who submitted questions and participated in tonight's conversation. We do apologize that we don't have time to get to them all, but we'll make sure that, Angela, that you get the copies. Opportunities to ask questions of iconic figures such as yourself are rare, and I've learned so much from my own community through these questions that were posed, and I'm going to be continuing to explore community as a form of self-care. On behalf of the Edmonton Culture Board and community partners, I want to thank Robyn Taylor and Shalini Sinha for tonight's conversation with Angela Davis. I'm really happy that you both will be continuing to stay with us to moderate the community panel. Angela Davis, we thank you for sharing the space with us tonight. I do want to read a comment that I captured earlier. It was from Alana Joy, and it said, "Miss Davis, you can't hear us, but we're all applauding your presence with us tonight." I think I can confidently speak for others when I say tonight's learnings will forever be etched in our memories, and we're honored that you were able to share your wisdom with members of the City of Edmonton community.
Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this wonderful program.
Thank you. So as we bid farewell to Angela Davis, I do want to now take the time to invite Tamira Mohammed on stage for a spoken word presentation. Tamira is a Somali-Canadian spoken word poet. Her practice is an exploration of identity, self, and community. Her work is a labor of love inspired by the storytellers that came before her. Tamira is the former City of Edmonton Youth Poet Laureate, has competed nationally at the Canadian Festival of Spoken Word, and is the co-author of the chapbook Water. She has performed for over 100 audiences across 5 cities and 2 countries, and is open for Grammy Award-winning artist Yassine Bey. Tamira will be sharing select works from her debut solo chapbook and poetry EP, Incantations of Black Love. Visit tamiramohammed.com to follow her work.
Thank you so much for the welcome, Rochelle and Dr. Davis. I'm not sure if you're still on the call, but it was an honor to get to hear you speak. And yeah, oh, there you are. And some of the works I'm sharing, the first one in particular, is inspired by the words you shared earlier today, specifically about the contributions of art to our community. So the work is titled Self-Portrait of the Artist as the Drinking Gourd. Imagine the artist pouring broken clay seeping, spilling out into the world. The artists will themselves into another sky. I see myself pour until there is only a memory and the art we remember to create. We watch in awe as the earth begins again, the everlasting story of Black womanhood, to have survived as a vessel full to the brim, still expanding until only the sky is left. And isn't the sky a story, a mirror? She that bore witness to the white sheet bear your right and new life, a canvas, a dissertation on Black life. I renamed the artist after every constellation, cosmic mess navigating the masses into a new tomorrow. The next piece is titled Alternate Ending to Queen and Slim. Imagine me leaning out the side of an old school car, its bones held together by rust and prayer. Picture my head a levitating afro of a cloud interrupting the sky. In this version of the story, skinfolk is kinfolk and everything is joy. The closing scene begins and we see them silk slip tracksuit saunter out onto the runway. The screen fades to black and the words, "The revolution will not be televised," appear. We file quietly out into the pews, and as the sun begins again, we ride. The streets flood with snakeskin boots and old school cars held together by rust and prayer. We watch a storybook tomorrow metamorphosize before us. In this version of the story, we give ourselves permission to imagine a future free of bloodstained pavements and lay to rest the tired echo chamber of a Black pain movie dying a slow death. Addendum, our art cannot exist in the shadow of whiteness. And the final piece I'll be sharing is titled Children Born of Close-Quartered Living. Take the poem to be the wet of a dark wave retreating. Take it to be the moon beckoning low tide. Take the poem to be the image of the do-rag slipping back. The slick wet of amber on the edges of a comb. Take it to be the edges of a scalp. Take the poem to be the black of this hair reverting into a story. Some nights you're six going home as the corners of a long night begin to fold in on themselves. Nights when you fell into the sky herself and melted into the blackened tar of a bottomless highway. Nights when you huddled into the close quarters of a belly laugh and learned to play dead on your aunt's living room floor. Learned to love like the other side of the pillow, like the mango clings to the pit. Have you ever tried to tear the flesh of the mango from the pit, except that the pit would keep some for herself? And the metaphor writes itself. You were 8 years old when you learned that even our bodies do not belong to us, that our loved ones could disappear in the span of a moment, and like the pit, we will always be left clinging to the remnants. Once, you found comfort in the in-between. Long before you ever learned to play hide and seek, learned to phase in and out of blackness, the product of things being taken from us too soon. To the inheritors of the in-between. Children born of close-quartered living, to the daughters of greasy scalp and hair wrapped before bed in hopes we may preserve the magic of the comb. To the boy in the black do-rag. I write to you in defense of every childhood we left behind, when we learned to phase in and out of blackness, in defense of every Black boy that couldn't perfect a disappearing act in time to save himself, in defense of the sacred, in defense of Black baby joy. Take the poem to be the wet of a dark wave retreating. Take it to be the moon beckoning low tide. Take the poem to be the image of the do-rag slipping back, the slick wet of amber on the edges of a comb. Take it to be the edges of a scalp. Take the poem to be the black of this hair reverting into a story. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Tamara. I just want to give this opportunity to Angela Davis. If you have any closing remarks or a message for our audience members today, I'll turn it back to you. You might be on mute.
Thank you. Thank you so much again for inviting me to participate in this wonderful gathering organized by Edmonton Culture. And I feel really inspired by all of the presentations, and I'm trying to follow the chat, trying to sense the community that you are creating and deepening through this process. And the spoken word was absolutely moving. So thank you so much. Tamara, how do you tell me the name of the spoken word artist? Tamara. Thank you so much, Tamara. I was very moved by your work, and let me wish you much success in the work that you do, whether it's artistic work or whether it's organizing work. And I look forward to visiting Edmonton again in person.
We would love to have you. Thank you so much. So thank you to Angela Davis, and thank you to Tamara. Tamara is a trailblazer within the community, and she's changing the landscape of how we challenge and deconstruct these systems of oppression. So I would like to segue now into our community panel. We'll be being joined by Robyn Taylor and Shalini. They have joined us again as they'll be moderating this discussion. And we're already probably feeling really inspired, but we're probably in that phase where we're asking ourselves, what's next? What do I do when I walk away from this space that we're sharing tonight? So I want to start introducing our panel of community members. So first up, Christine Sakomo Fredrick, who did our land acknowledgement for us. She is the Executive Artistic Director of the DreamSpeakers Festival Society, producer of the annual DreamSpeakers Indigenous Film Festival, as well as the Rubaboo Arts Festival. She is Cree Métis with 40 years of artistic experience. She is the first Indigenous Associate Artist of the Citadel Theatre and served on many artistic boards, including the Edmonton Sympathy Orchestra, the Edmonton Arts Council, and the Alberta Foundation of the Arts. She served on the committee for the Innu River Lot 11, one of the first Indigenous public art parks in the world, the City of Edmonton's Indigenous Artists in Residence, and the National Advisory Committee for the National Arts Centre Creation Fund. She produced, performed in a dance theater double bill national tour of Bears by Matt Mackenzie and her own play, Minosis Gathers Hope. She is the recipient of the 2000 Esquewo Award in Arts and the 2016 Mayor's Award for Excellence in Artistic Leadership. She just produced a global Indigenous showcase at the Dubai World Expo in November. Next up, I would like to introduce Dunia Noor, who you've also heard from already tonight. She is of African descent residing in Edmonton, Alberta. Dunia has a dual degree in social work and a Bachelor of Child and Youth Care, and an executive education certificate in business and executive leadership. Dunia Noor is currently the president of the African Canadian Civic Engagement Council, a national public affairs organization whose mandate is to protect and promote people of African descent's dignity and human rights while celebrating our people's significant contributions to our society and worldwide. Dunia has 15 plus years in creating mutual aid initiatives and building communities. As an avid community builder, researcher, and global thinker, Dunia uses her passion and expertise to create thriving communities where everyone has an equal opportunity to feel safe and thrive socially, culturally, and economically. Next up, I would like to introduce Veronica Fuentes. She is a Salvadorian, Nakaway Anishinaabe community organizer, artist, and advocate. Veronica is born and raised out of Treaty 6, but her family comes from Treaty 4, Yellow Quill First Nation. Veronica's current work is within the inner city as a bridge housing coordinator and grassroots community helper in many other ways. Veronica's work focuses on Indigenous harm reduction and rekindling traditional understandings of kinship, culture, and relationship to land. Over the last couple of years, she has played a large role in the conversations and organizing around climate justice, mutual aid, and houselessness in Edmonton area and beyond. And last but not least, we have Ufuoma Odebala, who is a woman of African descent, parent to 4 boys, now aged 24 to 13 with her ex-spouse, Owen. Motherhood has been a defining and motivating influence in her life, as well as an egalitarian strive for peaceful, safe, and just society. She is a registered social worker in BC and the Northwest Territories, a social entrepreneur, and a member of the Alberta Association of Black Social Workers. As the founder and executive director of Rees Community Foundation, and that's reescommunity.org, Ufuoma furthers the interests of people of African descent through research, policy, and advocacy. Ufuoma adopts a multidisciplinary and spirituality-inspired approach to her practice. One of her policy advocacy successes is the formation of the City of Edmonton's first ever Anti-Racism Advisory Committee. She can be contacted through resolutions@gmail.com. Well, my time with you tonight has come to an end. I would like to thank the Edmonton Culture Board and the community partners for trusting me with my role in tonight's presentation. It's such an honor to be here with you, before you, in the city of Edmonton, and I look forward to hearing from our panelists. So I'm going to do my final handover to Robyn and Shalini. Thank you.
Been doing this entire event. Welcome to the panel. We just heard from Dr. Angela Davis, and we're left with so many key gems. I've been writing notes the entire time. We talked about the connection and the relationship and necessity between art and activism, the necessity of abolition, especially how it can be framed within the 21st century landscape. We talked about the role of community in promoting care. And the first question that I want to pose to all of you is, what aspect of Angela Davis's work do you feel most connected with? And how do you use this in your community work today? If we could please start with Christine, and then in the order of my screen, we could start with Christine, and then Dunia, and then Veronica, and then we can end with Ufuoma.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. There's a multiple ways to answer this question. One of the first things is how my mentors and my elders reacted when I told them that I was going to be on this panel. The influence of Angela Davis, the work that she's done, not only in terms of like that intergenerational impact is there, but also, when we talk about the work of civil rights movement activists, advocates, etc., sometimes those things can carry in ways that we don't necessarily understand. And I'm so very grateful for the tone that's been put on to this discussion and panel, but also with Dr. Davies in its relation to the arts. And that's really the perspective that I come to, that I approach most things in the world, partly because I run an arts company. But one of the things that I was really excited about was looking at the intersectionality between the Indigenous rights movement and the Black civil rights movement historically and contemporarily. In my family, my grandfather was the president of the Métis Nation of Alberta through the 60s and 70s and 80s, actually, when he passed away. And my grandmother was also a very strong proponent of Indigenous culture and programming for Indigenous youth. They were a very high power couple in the 60s and 70s. In fact, many of the institutions that are still here today that serve Indigenous people were started by my grandparents, even in so much as not only politically, but also within the prison systems, supporting Indigenous people within those systems in all the various ways that Indigenous people are institutionalized. But it was sort of a family story that was in our history that I didn't pay much attention to until recently. And my grandmother passed away in 2005, and she asked me on her deathbed to write about her and my grandfather. And I, at the time didn't think I was worthy. But it's always sat with me. And one of the things that I've been trying to come to is, how do you write a story about activism that will not only resonate for those people who are close and intimate to that journey, but also for the community and for what hopefully would be a diverse audience. And one of the things that is the story in our family is that when the Black Panthers came to Canada, they stayed at my grandparents' house. This would have been in the late 60s. And I know that, first of all, it would have been fascinating beyond belief to be a fly on the wall for however long they stayed at my grandparents' house. The discussions would have been incredible, philosophical, political, social, spiritual, and the tenets that brought them even together in that moment would be very strong. And I feel like they're very strong today. And when I think of all of the programs that my grandparents started, everything from the hot lunch program to assisting our brothers and sisters who are in the prison system, starting housing and educational platforms. And I look at the history of the Black civil rights movement and the tenets of that movement, they are more than allies. There's that solidarity that's there. And when I think of the ways that this has influenced me and the work of Angela Davis, to me, that's one of the areas that I can get into now, is understanding that we here in this community here in Edmonton are looking for solidarity and creating ways that we can honor that solidarity, the struggle that we have each together. But artistically, one of the things that I'm very interested in revealing through arts is how those ties have already been there, that they were there decades ago. The people on this panel, our grandparents would have known each other. And there's no reason why we can't know each other now and join the fight together, and find ways that we can not only articulate this within our own struggles for civil rights, but when we meet together with each other. When we're meeting, there's a difference in the dialogue when we talk to our own people versus our white allies, and then how we then speak differently to our next generation, the people that we're mentoring and growing this not only civil rights movement, but also these civil rights, as in rites of passage into these movements and the struggles. So, I mean, I could go on, but I'm so excited to hear how other people are going to answer this question too. Thank you for the time. Hi.
Thank you, Christine. I think it was actually lovely to take a little bit of time with that, because you orated for us some of the oral history that is here in solidarity and connection with the Métis Nation, Indigenous people, Black Panthers, Black movement, and just solidifying that piece that Angela Davis was talking about how profoundly these two movements have supported and helped each other, and how we must back Indigenous existence and leadership and keep fighting for the solidarity of our communities at every single level. So thank you for taking the time to share that story. We're going to come to the other panelists on this question, and we're going to ask you to move through just a little bit quicker because we have a number of questions that we want to come through, but the panel is just beautiful. We're going to come to Dunia next. Dunia, do share with us your connection to Angela Davis's work and how it's impacted your current work.
Thank you so much for asking me that, Shalini. And Christine, it's always lovely hearing from you. And that really was a beautiful story. And thank you for sharing. For me personally, I just wanted to quickly share that I come from a long lineage of political prisoners. And I also come from a continent drenched in the blood of human rights revolutionary heroes. And I was born during a time of civil unrest and surrounded by many people that partaked in the Pan-African movement and taught by scholars that were very, very, very just thinking about deconstructing white supremacy systems and thinking about how we became displaced, enslaved, and colonized as people internationally. So when you grow up like that, naturally what happens is, whether you are a survivor of the genocide of Darfur or the genocide of Rwanda or the South African apartheid or Somalia's 30 years of unrest, or even coming from south of Birmingham, Alabama in the 50s and the 60s, where you witnessed bombings and your house being burned down by neo-Nazi white supremacists. There's something in you when you have that collective shared history, atrocity, and trauma that you just naturally gravitate towards finding a meaning for your existence, for humanity. And how I was raised and where I was raised in the community I grew up in, there was two things that's constantly instilled in us, two things. And that is, one, resiliency, and two, resistance. So when you grow up in that culture, you will naturally go on a quest to search for knowledge. And in that quest, I found Dr. Angela Davis, our African-American scholar, sister, who really pioneered a lot of the work that we reference today and that we're rehabilitating and building and developing our communities. At the age of 19, just to make it very quickly and respect time, I read Our Prisons Obsolete. And I won't go too long into this because I can talk all day. So stop me anytime, Shalini, please. Thank you for sharing. That book was profound because let me tell you what happened. I came back from Africa, first time ever. And there's something about Africa that just cleanses you spiritually and culturally and gives you a sense of purpose, because that's you're reconnecting with your land. And I went on a quest to question who I am and where I'm from as an African diaspora who grew up in Canada, born in Somalia, but never got to experience it due to displacement. And at the age of 18, once I came back and really felt the motherland, I end up questioning my sense of purpose, direction, and who I am and where I'm from. I've also lost a lot of family to gun violence, and almost all my cousins were in prison. And a lot of my family experienced prison in Africa and in Canada, and continue at this day as I'm talking to you, they're incarcerated in the Remand Center. As soon as I finished reading that book, the first thing I did is I prepared my cousin a bail plan, and I presented it to the provincial court. And I got my cousin out of jail and prepared his first rehabilitation community reintegration plan. It was that book that actually taught me the historical context of why prisons exist and how it's deeply connected to our history as people of African descent in terms of colonization and enslavement, and how prison was a tool to control all people of African descent and suppress them. So from there on, I started a work right now that is nationally happening, and the African Canadian Civic Engagement Council, who I am the president at, is now leading in terms of the impact race and cultural assessment for all people of African descent when they're interacting with the criminal justice system. From there on, we've rehabilitated 300 youth, got a lot of our sisters out of jail. We have stabilization programs. We write court reports, and I continuously go on this quest and journey of where I'm from and who I am because of that book. If anyone is listening, please read that book. I hope I was short enough, Shalini.
No, that was amazing, Dunia. I really appreciate the emphasis on storytelling that we have embedded throughout the panel. And Dunia, thank you so much for sharing how growing up in a culture of revolution and advocacy and community and resilience brought you to Dr. Davis's work, and how along with that work brought you to the first step of mobilizing towards your abolition and prison work journey. Veronica, I'm wondering your thoughts on how what aspects of Angela Davis's work you feel the most connected to, and how it influences your community work today.
Yeah, so similar to what Dunia was saying, with like where I come from, we call that blood memory. I think every language has like a term for that. We call it like intergenerational trauma, but it's not just trauma that we inherit, right? It's so many other like knowledge systems and stories that we don't even know exist in there, and that's again part of our knowledge system is that you inherit these things regardless of your material conditions, etc. And I think getting into like naturally, like I come from a family of residential school survivors, like 60 Scoop. My dad fled the war in El Salvador. He was messing around in there, had to get out. So similarly, I come from a family that is now trying to unlearn, not unlearn, but unpack a lot of the trauma. But I think the further I got into like what it looks like in Canada here, in so-called Canada, for what it means for Indigenous people to imagine a just future, the more I started getting all these, like all this language around Black feminist thought. But the problem with that was that it's kind of like in a lot of our Indigenous circles, there's like a long overdue recognition that needs to happen for minds such as Angela Davis, because it's, and I think in our circles of like reconciliation and stuff, Indigenous peoples today and for generations have been navigating settler violence and colonial violence, and our own Black and Indigenous incarceration through the lens that has been platformed and founded by leaders such as Angela Davis and founded by Black women. And I think a lot of Indigenous communities, we're just beginning to unpack a lot of like the anti-Black patriarchy that is so prevalent, and is so intentionally platformed, and kind of umbrellas a lot of our communities' understanding of the chief and council system, the Indian Act, the child welfare system, gendered violence against women, girls, Two-Spirit peoples, just like a very intentional agenda that does not honor all of our peoples. And I think, again, people are just beginning to unlearn a lot of this. So kind of being around mentors, it became very obvious very quickly that like Black feminist thought was not being credited for all the jargon that we use in our circles nowadays. And that is when I kind of felt, as I'm encouraged to do my own work of unpacking that. I think a lot of Indigenous people are very comfortable just being like, this is my land and this is what my elders say. But the problem is, like, when I just talking to a lot of people who come from like the AIM movement and stuff, like there was a lot of anti-Black racism coming from and like a lot of like violence against women, femmes, and Two-Spirit people within these movements. I think we're at a point now that again, by means of the resources I've had and the mentors I've had, kind of like reorienting my own community, my own Indigenous communities, to kind of acknowledge that. But again, the main thing is a long overdue recognition that is owed to Black families, communities all across Turtle Island. The generations of serious like decolonial work that's always been about fighting for a way of life that Black and Indigenous families deserve, a way of life that we are owed, a way of life that solves problems of the systemic racism that continues to kill our people, criminalize our people, and remove us from the territories. And everyone knows that our communities face large systemic and material barriers to wellness and justice, but even with this knowledge of the structural racism and liberal efforts to pull justice out of an unjust system, the Canadian justice system is assumed and expected to solve issues that are created by failed social governance and intentional imprisonment of our people. So just a lot of the works of Angela Davis have to be centered when we talk about how our communities cannot rely on Canada to solve our governing problems, because it's the same state that is imprisoning our people. And that comes back around to why we are demanding autonomy over our governance systems, title to our resources and territories, etc. I could go on forever about the parallels, but I just want to emphasize the long overdue recognition for the ways that her works has founded Indigenous movements today.
I really appreciate that message that you're bringing across there. And when I think back to what Angela herself was saying about recognizing the history of how Indigenous people helped stimulate the freedom of slaves and the resistance and the fight for freedom for slavery through this continent, and then you're also talking about how that critical thinking, that theorizing, that putting out freedom movements has come back and influenced and has really guided Indigenous movements. And I'll take it further, also wider, in that my own experience, absolutely, when I was a young adult, researching and studying in this space in the 90s, and not even on this continent, in Europe, it is these Black feminist thinkers who taught us with their thinking. Ufuoma, I want to come to you now so you can give you a chance to reflect on where it is you feel inspired by Angela Davis's work. And I'm also going to ask you if you want to connect it to what key message you would like to bring across to this audience here who's gathered here today in solidarity from the work that you do. And Ufuoma, you're just on mute. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
No.
Yeah, I really want to start by just honoring Dunia, because Dunia exemplifies mentorship, somebody who I worked with and mentored back in 2016, and we worked together in a very focused way for 2 years. And all the brainstorming late in the night, preparing for presentations to go to City Council, and strategizing. That's a bit of her work, of Angela Davis's work, that both of us were able to learn from each other. And the work we did back in 2016 began as the work I was doing as part of Black Lives Matter. But as with all community organizing, after a while, it becomes the last man standing. And 2 years into it, it was really literally two of us. And we had Donia's husband helping us as well, and a couple of other people that we worked really closely together to advocate for policies and policy changes. So that's one area. And that really kind of connects again to the other aspect of my work. My primary concern is really how we are coping. Because when we talk about oppression and racism and all of that and intersectionality, we talk about trauma, we know of the economic impact, we know of the health impact, but how are we coping in a way that is not self-destructive? So for me, the piece is really the importance of taking care of ourselves. And when we talk about solidarity, what does solidarity look like? Are we doing apart from getting the knowledge? Angela Davis again talks about self-care, and she connected self-care to community. For the whole community, we need to be mindful of what she talked about again, neoliberalism and capitalism. So to sum up, for me, it's really about to keep community, we need to be kind to each other. And this work is indeed a difficult work to do. And there's a time and a season. There's a time to slow down. And if you feel like slowing down, take it and slow down. And yes, there's a time to be in front. So for me, my big message is that just that piece of self-efficacy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ufuoma. I think that is such a valuable perspective and gem to leave with us, how important it is for us to start centering community care and coping through the advocacy work that we do, because it is violent, it is harmful, but there is that power, like Angela Davis was mentioning, in community and that ability to heal and restore. So thank you so much for bringing that perspective with us and sharing that with us. Veronica, I was wondering the issue that you're currently trying to help people understand so that we can progress towards systemic change within Edmonton.
I had some notes written and I can go on about that, but it was interesting, kind of just like leading on that, back to how like the work is like really hard, and like what I was actually one of my knowledge keepers today. He was, because I working on the front lines. I see a lot of overdoses. I see a lot of people passing away, and it hits close to home because it's often like residential school survivors, 6 scoop survivors, like elders to me, right? And those are people that we love so deeply and we're so deeply related to all the time. And he was just giving us all shit about how you can't get too involved in the work, and because you have too much to give, you don't give enough to yourself. And my main point around that would be, in Edmonton here, there's like a lot of initiatives, a lot of reconciliation initiatives, but there's not a lot of like giving land back initiatives. You know what I mean? It's like reconciliation is violence, and the city's built on violence and continues to displace and incarcerate so long as it means reparations aren't given, so long as it means it doesn't jeopardize the colonial agenda. So what I often say, like, people can literally imagine the absolute destruction of my territories and the end of the world before they can imagine a future without capitalist colonial violence. And that's like funny to me, because it's like, we have stories and prophecies and all that, but greater empires than this have fallen before. And like what has been argued in these territories since time immemorial is that our traditional knowledge systems have worked in these territories, and Black and Indigenous communities are leading those solutions on the ground. Again, my personal work right now has been around like centering Indigenous knowledge systems or sort of justice systems, and bringing kinship circles back to the forefront of the housing and opioid crisis. And obviously there's a settler responsibility to lift this work up. But what's even more important than that, I feel I'm learning more and more about how this is so much more important, is for us to stay grounded in why we do this. And I say this a lot as well, where I feel like I've spent a lot of time convincing settlers that I'm Indigenous and this is why it's cool, rather than like being Indigenous for myself, if that makes sense. So it's where Canada wants to encourage us to be the Indigenous lawyer, to be the Indigenous doctor, and to be the Indigenous oil lobbyist. But Canada has never encouraged us to stand up on the front lines for our territories, and Canada has never encouraged us to pursue our inherent title to the land. Canada has never encouraged us to act and perform our inherent Aboriginal title and all those things, right? So although as we need the Native academics and we need the Indigenous frontline workers and the Indigenous scholars and all these things, I think, I know myself, I often neglect to tend to the way of life my ancestors have argued, and I forget to prioritize ceremony, I forget to get on the land, I forget to ask my elders for the stories and teachings they fought so hard to preserve. Again, I've had such incredible mentors and have been brought into ceremony alongside a lot of powerful land defenders and land users and cultural carriers, all of which has grounded me to do the work in a good way, but that sometimes the work is also, it has to be about going back to my territory. It has to be learning the language. It has to be learning how to skin a moose. It has to be about encouraging the culture, because the culture is our humanity, and humanity is what all this is for. So I think what I'm all about these days is more like building that power internally, building that power with your peers and your family and the people you love, and making that a priority over trying to argue why you deserve those things, if that makes sense.
It so much more than makes sense. It is so powerful, Veronica. I'm watching people just open up and explode here, listening to you talk about claiming and being that Indigenous person that an Indigenous person is and wants to be, and that stance about standing against where Canada is demanding that you be an Indigenous person who's a lawyer or in what other position, but not that one who fights for treaty rights and land rights. And by the way, I will just add there that the UN did come out with a report recently this year that demonstrated that through Indigenous treaty rights activism, land rights activism, 100 billion tons of carbon has been kept in the ground, meaning that this climate crisis that everyone is experiencing right now with the floods and the fires and the polar vortexes would have been exponentially worse without Indigenous freedom, treaty rights and activism. That's the word I'm looking for. Christine, I know your head is buzzing and you're writing notes, you were cheering. I really, really want to come to you to get to speak about what is the key message you would like to get across to this audience, and also to think about the calls to action, those things that people can take away that they can practically do. I know everyone here there in the chat, they're talking about how impactful the knowledge building has been for this event. And let's help give them some action pieces as well, and honoring your position and coming from the arts in that.
Thank you so much. I was so excited about all the things that have been said. In terms of calls to action, from my perspective, being in the arts world, one of the key things is to support artists. I mean, it's not brain surgery, it's art. Is to engage in art, remove yourself from the idea that there is this Eurocentric idea of elitism in art. And like from my elders, in doing this work, I've had so many times of growing up in mainstream, the pressure of assimilation is huge, especially when you're a young person. And, looking towards the arts in some way to express that. Honestly, my family was a huge political family, and I was sort of the black sheep going, it's scary. I don't know what, I'm going to go do Shakespeare. Only really realizing it in the end, how political art is anyway, and how quick we can actually get to the real work once you just accept it's political. People will see it as political, even if you don't want it to seen that way. So just accept it and then go for it. In terms of the artists that are out there, but in terms of just people, what do you want to do to to activate your own self, to be proactive in this fight where, you know, like we've said before, it's not good enough to not be a racist, be an anti-racist. And that is to support artists, support the work that they're doing. If you run an organization and you're thinking, oh, there's all this reconciliation money, I'm going to start something. Don't do a darn thing until you've spoken to Indigenous people. You cannot have a reconciliation project without the revelation of the truth. And anything that happens to placate and calm and do all that soft, touchy feeling that is about alleviating white guilt, just get away from me. You're not even on board yet. Get in line. One of the things I was super, super stoked with on stuff that Veronica was saying was something that recently happened to me about being asked by non-Indigenous people, by Canadians, why can't you just be a regular Canadian? And that is such a hard, and you know, something that Angela Davis mentioned earlier, the layers, the complexity when it comes to identity is not to be understated. And one of the reasons why I got really fired up about this concept is that, number one, Indigenous people have a different relationship with the government of Canada. We are not regular Canadians. And number two, the idea that somehow we're not regular Canadians, as if we are not contributing to this society to the hilt, is absurd. When I look at all of the stuff that I've done throughout my life, at being involved again in the family that I've been involved in, but also within my own culture, there is not a single effing Canada Day that my culture has not been on freaking display and parade for other peoples to understand their concept of Canada. There has been, from my own life, and I know this is happening to people all over this country, not even Indigenous, IPOC artists all over the place, and how we represent the Canadian culture. I have been in parades, I've been on panels, I've been literally, I mean, like I said, I just came back from Dubai representing Canada. And the ways that IPOC artists represent Canada are way past some of the idiocy that people comment on. Why can't you be a regular Canadian? Because most of those people who ask that question have never had to be on display the way IPOC artists have been on display to represent this country, to show Canadians and the rest of the world what is Canada. Woo! Thank you so much for letting me get that out. Holy moly, I've been keeping that in for some time. And to recognize that that representation comes at a cost to IPOC artists, to Indigenous artists, when we are literally paraded on Canada Day, when non-Indigenous arts organizations decide they want to do something Indigenous to get on the bandwagon. It's always on the backs of Indigenous people. And I know that it's on the back of other IPOC artists. And when I say calls to action, I say, start with your own understanding of what is Canada. Support IPOC artists, go see their work. And I don't mean just at the elite high, regional places like this, not to bash them. I love them. Edmonton Symphony Orchestra, Citadel Theatre, all the ballet and all that. Not just those places though. Find out who's in the hole in the wall, who's trying to do stuff, who's got no operating fund. Seek out those organizations and effing support them. And even as Indigenous people, support your artists. Sometimes it's as simple as more brown bums in seats. Thank you so much. Hi.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Christine. And also, just to let the audience know, some folks may not know here, but this is the mission that Edmonton Culture founded on, which was to connect community to these artists where they are. IPOC artists in those holes in the wall, organizing these events. An event like this is organized entirely by volunteers to bring this to community. And so in solidarity, Christine, can I actually, I'm so moved, I have goosebumps from your presentation there. Can I continue with you for a minute? Because I'd like to ask you if you could talk about this connection between racism and the climate emergency and what you would like people to know, please.
Of course. We have a climate emergency right now. Of course, we are beginning to realize this, but I know that my elders have spoken about this for more than decades. And I'm so empowered when I meet with other Indigenous people, because there's that solidarity and that we move together as one as much as possible. One of the things is that, again, I just came back from the Dubai World Expo. And this is the first expo where multiple countries decided that they would put their Indigenous peoples first. Most expos, of course, are focused on their industry and cool things about them that they want to promote. I'm so excited that this year, so many, especially like New Zealand, led the charge that they were going to put their Indigenous people at the forefront. There was a full-on Taratini symposium about knowledge sharing, everything from language revitalization to media and subculture, pop culture and stuff. But at the forefront of these discussions was the concept of climate refugees. And I know that climate refugees are the world over, but I think as Canada, it's something new. We've as a country have sort of thought of ourselves as a rather safe country climate wise, and we are super on fire, being flooded. And I applaud actually Kevin Loring, who runs Savage Society Theatre in Vancouver, but he's also the Indigenous programmer at the National Arts Centre. And he spoke in Dubai about his home community, which this past summer was on fire. His whole community burned to the ground. There's nothing left. And while he was there in Dubai talking on multiple things, his community again was now underwater. And the heart that he had, that was suffering, that was grieving, that was so brave. And I know I'm focusing on Kevin, but honestly, it's all Indigenous artists. I think of amazing artists like Canahus Manuel, who does a lot of climate activism. She's an inspiration. One of the things that I hear from Indigenous people is that there are multiple approaches that are required. There's not one right thing to do. There are grassroots activists who know that they have incredible programs and approaches that work, and they don't always meet up with the objectives of government and people in the corporate sector. And there's some dialogue about, well, should we be doing this? Should we be doing that? In Dubai, I heard a great phrase that I freaking love, and it's called, they refer to the activism as breath to breath. And knowing that when we need to do this work, that's one of the first places to start, that we are intimately tied to our environment. Our identity is attached to it. We are not only resilient because of the trauma we experienced, but because of the innovation that we express. And this is the kind of stuff that I want people to understand, is that Indigenous people have been thinking, deliberating about this climate issue for millennia. And there's intrinsic knowledge, there's contemporary knowledge, there's traditional knowledge, there's the multiple approaches that we need to start solving this right away. And I loved the way Kevin talked about there being a need for a constellation of Indigenous organizations, but I would be so brave as to say a constellation of different movements and approaches to this complex issue, but we cannot waste a single more minute. That's where I'm at.
That was incredibly powerful. I'm snapping, I'm clapping, I'm writing, I'm doing every single thing to relate to this. What has been said, that was amazing. And hearing that call to action for a constellation of organizing and approaches towards climate action, especially centering Indigenous leadership, is so powerful. Dunia, I wanted to ask you too, what are your calls to action that you would like to leave with our audience when it comes to furthering and eliminating systemic, when it comes to further eliminating systemic inequity?
Yeah, definitely. I just wanted to quickly go by some things. First and foremost, to my sister Ufuoma, thank you so much for your kind words. You're someone that continuously inspires me, and I really appreciate you more than anything in the world. I remember when there was a time that all of our youth, all African youth, were getting expelled and suspended from school, and just mass incarcerations. Ufuoma and I were sitting down one day and we're like, what do we do? And Ufuoma's like, make me, write me as their trustee, or I don't know, she used this legal term. And we're like, okay, we're down. And any, young person that gets expelled or suspended, she would literally go to the school board and say, explain. So why did you feel that you needed to deal with this youth punitively? And there was no option of restoration. And that was so powerful. And that really taught me a lot. Veronica, you also taught me just by this panel. You gave me a vocabulary today that I think explains a word that I've been looking for such a long time, which is blood memory. And I can't wait to focus and research what that actually means. I have an idea of what it might mean. I also wanted to really talk about Christine and thank her so much for everything that she shared, and the fact that we as people of African descent living in Edmonton, Alberta, are actually beneficiary of some of the things that her family pioneered. And I just found out recently that Native Counseling Services, whom we as the African Canadian Civic Engagement Council developed a whole court work program around, was also founded by Christine's family. So thank you so much. Everything that we do for our youth in terms of rehabilitation, reintegration, getting to know ourselves, our ancestors, and healing from colonial violence. Honestly, we have a lot to give back, and also first and foremost appreciate our Indigenous elders. I've learned my social work school, my undergrad, I learned from Indigenous elders. And any time that I had conflicting ideologies or sadness or trauma triggers, instead of going to the counseling services for mental health, and when it comes to stress and trauma and vicarious trauma from the texts that we're learning, I would actually go to the Native Counseling Services. And that's when elders would say, what is your tribe and who's your people? Where I come from, you don't ask what is your tribe, because the last memory that we had in the land that we ran away from is there was a tribal war and a clan war, and it was devastating, and it was a genocide. So just healing back and now learning how to use that in a way that is so beautiful, it's humbling. So thank you all. I just deeply connect with everyone in this panel, including Shalini and Robyn as well. So I appreciate you all, and just hearing Dr. Angela Davis today was very amazing. I just want to say that there's a huge crisis that's happening in Edmonton, Alberta, that we really need to pay attention to. And I'm going to speak in the context of people of African descent, because that's a culture that I can speak to and that I'm intimately connected with, and that I'm from as well. Our youth are disproportionately being incarcerated in a way that is not statistically normal, first and foremost. Most of our youth are being incarcerated for crimes of poverty, for having mental health, for living with trauma, for living with addictions, and pretty much criminalizing the Black bodies. And it's very sad to see young boys that are 18, 19 call me from prison, and they literally were the same youth that were expelled and suspended, and I've watched them grow, and we've advocated and went to their school. And they're just transitioned into Edmonton EYOC, then transitioned into the remand. And years after, they're calling you and telling you, and Elle's poem really touched me and brought tears to my eyes, because that's what we live with on a daily basis. That's what I see, and that's what my work entails. And when I see a young kid from the Black community that calls me that he was sexually assaulted in jail, that's something we're not speaking of publicly. And that's what the conditions of colonial violence creates for our youth. When you mass incarcerate people because of crimes of poverty, and you put them in situations that they have no choice, but they have to fight back. And they go in there being a part of the community, and they come out and they're completely institutionalized, and now they inflict harm on people and on themselves. That's really what institutionalization means, and that's what the prison industrial complex means. And that's what we really need to pay close attention to. And there's a lot of sisters that, are disproportionately overrepresented in the prison system that also we're working with on a daily basis that are women of African descent. You know what they all have in common? Majority of them are sexual survivors. So they experience sexual assault. And these are the things that we need to talk about. I'm going to conclude with this. There's a lot to talk about. There's a lot to brainstorm. There's a lot that I'm learning just from this panel. But if there's one thing that I can leave with everyone to really pay attention to, is the United Nations International Decade for People of African Descent. That declaration recognizes 3 things. And the first thing it recognizes is recognition. The second thing, and what is this recognition? That all people of African descent, whether they're Africans, Caribbeans, or African American, they all have distinct cultures and they belong to a distinct group whose human rights must be protected and honored. And that we all, one way or another, have survived colonization, genocide, enslavement, displacement. And that's the first thing. So what I'm asking everyone, and I don't know how many people are watching this, is please, the African Canadian Civic Engagement Council have launched the campaign today for the city of Edmonton, who stated that they are incorporating 100-day advocate, 100 day of championing anti-racism and putting a strategy together. We want the city of Edmonton to adopt the United Nations Declaration for People of African Descent, and not just adopt it, not just recognize it, but really implement it and focus on the 3 areas, which is recognition, justice, and development. Police brutality, the mass killings, the mass incarceration, crimes of poverty, houselessness, mental health, addiction, those are all symptoms of colonial violation and displacement. So if you want to join us, please, I'll put on our website.
We have it up there, actually. It's gone up there. The form has gone up there so people can check it. Thank you so much, Dunia. And people can check the form and get involved. We're rapidly running out of time, and we're not going to go without coming back to our last few panelists. Elle Jones is coming back to us, and we're going to do a wrap up. So very quickly, Ufuoma, your last words are calls to action. And I'm just going to ask, and my apologies for Ufuoma and Veronica, to just mind the time, and we'll be bringing this to an end. But let's hear from you, your last words.
Okay. Just in 2 words, what Dunia just described is a word that Angela Davis used: racial capitalism. For me, the take-home call to action that ties into the point I made earlier is the fact that we need to recognize the reality of lateral violence. What do I mean by lateral violence? We are all in pain. Everybody is in pain. If you have different options, and one of those options is to be kind, choose kindness. Do not use your pain. Weaponize it. Weaponize your privileges and use it to harm another person. Don't harm another indigenous person or another Black person or another person of African descent. Do not do that. Unfortunately, that's way too common. We need to develop self-efficacy to be able to contain this violence, and we need to be mindful to take care of one another. That's my message.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Go ahead, Robyn.
Sorry, I was having a tech difficulty there. Yes, thank you again, Ufuoma, for that. And I really appreciate how throughout the panel you've elucidated these key pillars that we need to start recognizing when it comes to moving forward, when it comes to the struggle for justice and lateral violence, and addressing the root causes of lateral violence, and how we approach healing from lateral violence is going to be something that is even more and more and more, that becomes more and more and more and more important. Veronica, I was wondering, what are the action items that you would like to leave our audience with today as we close out our session?
I feel like I was kind of vague along the whole panel, but there's this piece from a Tuck and Wayne Yang piece called "Decolonization is Not a Metaphor." It's like it's constantly circulated in our circles, and like from this piece, it is argued that decolonization is not a swappable term for like the things we want to do to improve our societies. And it argues that decolonization doesn't have a synonym. What I recommend from this, and this is outdated in a lot of ways, that piece, but what I've recommended is to divest from language and agendas that argue a future where justice and colonial violence, such as prisons, resource extraction, child welfare system, the reservation system, exploitation of labor and land, can all exist simultaneously on these territories, because it can't happen. And I think when we engage in non-action oriented justice, and solely engage within the boundaries of reconciliation that we are handed by Canada, it legitimizes the permanency of the settler state. It protects settler colonialism, and by arguing its inevitability, fails to recognize colonialism as an ongoing project, which only further erases our communities and our lived experiences. So personally, I like to imagine a future where the conversation around decolonization shifts away from over-explaining my needs to settlers, but instead through example, by living out our traditional ways in a sovereign capacity. So what I argue is that this future that we imagine, it cannot be watered down to how we demand a better society, because and it cannot and it will not operate in society as we know it. And what that means is land back is also not a metaphor. It literally means a transfer of territory. It means monetary transfer. This means shutting down the tar sands someday. This means abolishing the child welfare system, chief and council system. This means advocating for Indigenous governance. And more importantly, it means building power in our own communities, because we cannot wait around for white people to give us the land back nicely, as we have inherent title to it, and we are owed so much more than what our communities are currently dealing with. And with all this theory and knowledge, and I just encourage people to live that in practice. Okay, that's it.
No, that was phenomenal. Yeah, and I think it wraps up and pushes us forward more when it comes to everything that we've discussed, this idea of action-oriented justice and being bold and being accountable and being critical and, continuing that movement forward. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. I am so pleased to see Elle Jones again. Thank you so much for your piece that you shared earlier today and the setting, the context that you provided us with. I'm going to leave it to you to leave us with some closing words and remarks. So feel free to take the stage.
Thank you, everybody. I know it's really late, so I'm going to try not to be really long. I'll try and do this very fast. It's so beautiful to see everybody on this panel, just what the teachings that were being shared, the love and solidarity between women, the messages around storytelling and history. It was just really beautiful. This panel was all that. I hope people stayed around for it. I guess in terms of solidarity, I really want us all to avoid what I sort of call the Angela Davis effect, which is that we bring Angela Davis into our communities, and for one night, everybody applauds being radical. And then we go back the next morning and there's nobody at the police board when people are asking for defunding. There's nobody challenging the expansion of prisons, that people are still by themselves taking calls. People still by themselves trying to bring groceries. It's Christmas and people are trying to, do fundraisers to get people a meal. So I really ask us to not just, come and clap for Angela tonight and then go okay, that's done. That was cool. Celebrity hairstyle, I'm done. The point is she's not doing this to come to a community and leave nothing there. She's doing these talks so that we can take from it and build into our own work. So I encourage us all to continue this work every day in our communities. Find out what's happening at Edmonton Max. Find out what's happening follow Freelands Free People, which is an amazing Indigenous-led abolition movement across all of the prairie provinces, and they're organizing in amazing ways. So follow them, follow their fundraisers. Make sure that every day go to noprisons.ca and see what's being fought across this country. Everything from the impacts of COVID to prisoner-led resistances in court to continuing to challenge the new solitary confinement, instruction intervention units. There's so much work being done. So, however many people, hundreds of people that were there tonight, if even half of us would come out and support these movements, we would have a much stronger base. So I just encourage us all to find that power, to take that energy that we felt tonight from everybody and everything that's happening in the chat, and believe that we can do this. Abolition is not just a project of ending things, it's a project of building things. And to do that, we need to build community. We need to show presence. We need to show up for each other. We've seen it in the panel tonight. I'm here because of love and solidarity between Black women, where Dunia is like looking out for me and she's like, yo, I want you to come. And I'm like, are you sure it's like in your city? And she's like, no, we need this solidarity across Canada. And it's just beautiful to be a part of that. So I want to remind us all that neoliberalism makes us believe that there's no path through the system, that, you know, they're in our phone, they're all powerful, they can get an injunction in court, they can watch us, they can tell us whatever to do. So we feel that we can't do anything, and sometimes we just get stalled. But do the little thing. If it's a toy drive, do it. If it's just clicking like, do it, and build from there. So one day it's clicking like, and the next day it's showing up at the rally, the next day it's organizing, the next day it's a tenancy group, and the next day you're lying under the deportation van and coming up in handcuffs, right? Like we don't just go there. We get there by every day doing the work in our communities to rebuild, to heal, to find new solidarity. And we saw that tonight. So I'm going to stop, but this was really, really beautiful. Thank you, Edmonton. Thank you for all your work. Thank you for this femme-led, woman-led panel. It's been beautiful to see, and I'm so glad I was a part of it. And let's keep doing this work every day together.
How wonderful. What a wonderful evening we have shared together. It has been powerful beyond measure. Some of us, you know, when we heard Angela Davis was coming, we were preparing, we were excited, we were nervous, we knew it was going to be amazing. But this evening has been absolutely incredible. I'm going to leave you with a couple notes from the night. Art allows us to see and feel things which we can't yet understand. How we mentor each other, and letting elders turn to youngers to be mentored. The trans movement has been central in asking us to question what we have always assumed was normal. Capitalism affects the way we imagine solutions and community as a form of self-care. And then what can I say about this panel? Woo, this panel. So there's actually a note here in the chat from the public that says the interview with Angela Davis was great, but this panel and the artists were even better. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? No one can imagine such a thing. And I am not at all taking for granted the power and the beauty and the wisdom and grace that has been Angela Davis. And we came together because she came here with us. And this has been an incredible night. So I want to thank all the contributors, including Tamirda Muhammad and El Jones, who's back here with us. I want to thank our sponsors, who have been the Black-Owned Market, Edmonton Community Foundation, DreamSpeakers, the City of Edmonton, the Pride Centre, Shift Lab, the Africa Centre, and the Caribbean Women's Network. Again, this was an absolutely free event, brought to you by community to community. And it was powerful. There's nothing less in the quality that was presented here. And if you enjoyed it, then do remember this was put together by volunteers. And I encourage you and invite you to donate to Edmonton Culture. You can, if you'd like to be a partner with them, you can get in touch at info@edmontonculture.com. And you can get in touch through their website, edmontonculture.com, to donate, and through all their social media. So it has been a pleasure to be with you tonight on behalf of all the contributors, and in solidarity with Angela Davis, I wish you safety and a very good night.
And is Christian here? Christian, you should come say hi, because thank you for all your organizing as well.
That's a really good point, Al. We should thank the man that's behind this organizing, and he's always hiding, so we should have
We don't know if he'll come out.
Maybe not, but anyway, I know that there's always so much coordinating work. There's people behind the scenes, so thank you, and particularly to Christian for setting this up.
Yeah, absolutely. The organizing behind this has been incredible. There's been so much work, and you're absolutely right, Elle, to name the vision of one person who made this all happen. So we've all rallied together in community, and he'll be the first to say that. But, you know, one person had this idea and moved it forward. So we honor that. Absolutely. Okay, so with that, all the chats are continuing to come in. Our panel and contributors, remember, hang around and we can connect with each other. And we wish you all good night.